As the British came up the road towards Lexington, in the town itself, Captain John Parker, the commander of the town's militia, summoned his militia company. They stood on Lexington Green awaiting the arrival of the British. Well, they didn't come. It was dark and it was cold. And so Parker told his men to stand down. He would call them when the British were announced, when they finally arrived. He told them that he would call them by the sound of the drum. And so they retired to a local tavern, to their homes to await. About dawn, the announcement came that the British indeed had been spotted at the south end of the town. Parker immediately summoned the young William Diamond, the drummer boy, to sound the alarm. The militia gathered again on Lexington Green. They were standing off to the side of the green. They were not standing in the road. Indeed, they were not standing in any way that would have blocked the advance of the British soldiers. As the British soldiers came close to the Americans, Parker was telling his men, "Stand your ground, stand your ground." As the British approached, there was at the very tip of the diamond shape, of the triangular shaped Lexington Green, at the very tip there was a small building. For one brief moment, the officers leading the British contingent and the enlisted men were separated. In the meantime, the British officers are yelling at the Americans, "Put down your arms, put down your arms." And Parker is telling them, "Stand fast, stand fast." A moment of high tension, of confusion. People were scared. It was at that moment when the British soldiers were, for such a brief moment, separated from their officers, that a shot rang out. To this day, we don't know who fired that shot. But in this moment, when the British soldiers heard that shot, without their officers being present to lead them, they lowered their muskets with bayonets and advanced towards the Americans and opened fire. When the smoke cleared, several Americans were dead. Others were wounded. By this time, the British officers had regained control of their men, formed them up, and began the march on to the town of Concord. As they approached Concord, since it was no secret anymore, the colonel in command ordered the band to begin to play. Flags unfurled, band playing now, they advanced towards Concord. The Concord militia by this time had also been alerted and warned, and they too had been gathering. Men from the town of Concord and Acton, Sudbury, had gathered nearby at a place called Punkatasset Hill. It was the prearranged militia gathering place. There, several hundred men had gathered to wait, not knowing what was happening. When the British arrived in the center of Concord, the colonel in command immediately dispatched 2 small contingents to control the bridges that crossed the Concord River leading into the town of Concord. One of them, North Bridge. The soldiers went to North Bridge, and some soldiers went beyond North Bridge onto a farm looking for munitions that might be hidden there. In the meantime, the American militia moved from Punkatasset Hill down closer to the town. They wanted to see what was happening. As they came to a small hill overlooking the North Bridge, the Americans looked and saw rising from the town smoke. They thought that the British were burning their homes. The British were not. They were burning some of the munitions that they had found, gun carriages. But the men from Concord and Acton thought their homes were being destroyed. They began to come down off the hill towards the bridge. As they came towards the bridge, the British soldiers defending the bridge warned them, "Stay back, stay back, stay back." They began to tear up the bridge. That, of course, was destroying public property, something the Concordians could not stand. And so they continued down the hill. As they came close to the bridge, the British soldiers leveled their muskets and fired. As they fired, the American colonel in command is supposed to have leaped in the air, crying out, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sakes, fire." At that moment, the first casualty at the bridge went down. His name from the town of Acton, Isaac Davis. When the smoke cleared from this brief engagement, the British soldiers greatly outnumbered, retreated from the bridge. They went back into the town of Concord. The Americans didn't know what to do. They had just fired on the king's troops. They had fired on the king's troops. They stood and waited. In the meantime, the British soldiers who had been on the other side of the bridge marched down the road and went across the bridge. The Americans did not try to stop them. By noon, all of the British had gathered back in the town of Concord to prepare for their march back to Boston, a distance of about 18 miles. They left the center of town and marched back on the same route by which they had come out. When they got east of the town, about a mile, they came to a place called Miriam's Corner. There at Miriam's Corner, they encountered militia coming from the town of Reading. There at Miriam's Corner, they fired upon one another. From that place, Miriam's Corner, all the way back to Boston, would for the rest of this sad day be one long running fight. By the time the British got back to Lexington, they were bedraggled, tired. They had lost many, many men, and many more were wounded. They were, in fact, on the verge of surrender. But it was at that point that a relief column arrived from Boston and saved the day for the British. The relief column married up with the bedraggled British who had suffered at the battles, and together they marched back to Boston, through the town of Monotamy, now called Arlington. And when they came into Cambridge, they decided not to try to cross the Charles there, but to turn and go to Charlestown. And so they marched to Charlestown. There they rested. They took up arms and prepared to defend themselves from an American attack, which did not happen. By the evening of the April 19th, 1775, this engagement was over. More than 200 British soldiers had been wounded or killed, and about half that number Americans. The war had begun. What had thus far been protest, dumping tea in the harbor, boycotts, broadsides, speeches, was now an open revolution. The American cause had begun.